Good morning. So I might be able to guess what's going through some of your minds right now. Oh my gosh, the whole staff must be on vacation. They have just sent up the C team. If you don't know me, my name is Dan Johnson. I'm the youth intern here at Harbor Covenant, so I get to hang out with middle school and high schoolers. In all seriousness, I really am excited to be with you guys today and to learn what God is trying to teach us today. If you don't know much about me, I grew up here in Gig Harbor. In fact, I actually grew up going to this church. So it's been really great to come back from college and thank so many people who believed in me and poured into me to make me the person I am today. Many of you might associate me with my two younger brothers, Andrew and Bradley. And growing up with two brothers, we definitely push each other to the limits physically. And because we were always pushing the boundaries, our parents would give us various rules to keep us from hurting each other. And sometimes us brothers would, in the heat of the moment, test how legitimate our parents' commands were. So if our parents had told us to keep the wrestling outside the house and the crazy tackling games, well, when we would run into each other with cushions in the bonus room and knock teeth out, we were reminded that our parents actually did want what was best for us, and knew what was best for us, for that matter. I have memories as a kid running into each other with cushions, playing kitchen hockey games, making these crazy BMX bike jumps, rollerblading down the steepest hills in our neighborhood, and sliding on our butts halfway down. Both me and Andrew have each knocked out a tooth out of Bradley's mouth, which is why the youngest brother is always the toughest. As reckless as we were at times, for the longest time, none of us broke any bones. It was miraculous. But we did have one thing in common. All three of us have scars on our heads from jumping off the couch when we were young, screaming some kind of Batman tagline, and landing on something substantial, splitting our heads open, all three of us at different times. Now, don't get me wrong, Batman is very real. It's just that at a young age, we got confused at who could fly and who could not, and we were just trying to summon the wrong superhero's powers. I think that was the problem. Growing up with every set of stitches and injury, time and time again, I learned that my parents really did know what was best for me and wanted what was best for me. So it became easier and more natural for me to trust and obey them. And I also just wanted to honor and respect my parents by obeying them, even with the small things in life. Maybe you're like me and you grew up with authority figures in your life that you could trust and obey. But maybe you're sitting here today and when I talk about obedience, you think about authority figures in your life now or back then that you trusted and obeyed, but you got burned. You realized not everyone in this life can be trusted. Today we're going to be looking at obedience and asking the question, before we obey, maybe, can we trust God enough to obey? Can we trust the one who's calling us to obey? But before we get there, I want to cast a vision for where we're going in this new series that we're starting today. So today we're starting off a series of what we're calling Living Faith. And our series is anchored in Hebrews chapter 11, which is talking all about faith and giving encouragements to people to live by faith in all aspects of their lives. And I'm personally excited for this series because I think it's a chance for us to look into 2019 and to realign ourselves with what matters and what is central to us and about living for God. In this series, we'll get a chance to look at the new year and ask how God is calling us individually, but also collectively as a church, to step into the new plans he has for us. I'm also looking forward to this series because if you haven't noticed, we live in a world right now that is so quick to critique anything that can't be backed up with facts. And yet, it seems as though God is calling us to something so much deeper than what we can touch and see, but to a spiritual reality with him and with each other. I also think we can relate to the original audience of the letter to the Hebrews. See, the people that were being written to were traditional Jewish Christians who grew up with knowing the Old Testament and practicing the ceremonies and the sacrifices and traditions, and they had become full devoted followers of Jesus. But see, at the time of this letter, people started to realize times just weren't like they used to be. Following Jesus seemed to have a bigger price tag on it. There was greater persecution and greater temptation and pressure to go back to their old, comfortable traditions. And so the letter to the Hebrews is full of warnings, mainly warnings to people encouraging them to hold on to their faith in Jesus, even in the darkest and hardest and unclear times. And so since we're talking about faith in this series and what it means for us, I thought it'd be probably a good place to start with a definition of what we see faith is. And the author of Hebrews actually gives it to us pretty clearly. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, the author says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. I also like another translation that says, "The fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, this faith, is a firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see." In other words, it's saying that our faith isn't just about a wishful thinking. It's about a confidence that is so real, a hope that is rooted in Jesus and what he has already done for us. But then the author goes on. They move on from this definition and they say, well, hey, don't just take it from me. Take it from this long list of followers of God that have gone before you. And so the rest of chapter 11 is full of references of people, mostly in the Old Testament, that the audience would recognize. And it goes through person by person in the Old Testament, showing how each person was living by faith and how they were used by God to be a blessing to the world and to fulfill his promises to his people. And so in this series, each week we're going to be taking a look at a different person listed in this chapter, a different story, and asking ourselves, what did their faith look like in their time, and what can we learn from it? And how does living by faith in Jesus work itself out into our own context of life? And so today we're going to be looking at a great example of living by faith that's in Hebrews 11, and that's with the story of Noah. And today I want to focus on the idea that as Christians, our obedience is to a voice we can trust. As Christians, our obedience is to a voice we can trust. So that's where we're headed today. So if you're in Hebrews chapter 11, it mentions the Noah story in verse 7, chapter 11, verse 7, and it says this: "By faith, Noah, when warned about things not seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith." So as you know, this verse mentioning the Noah story is actually referencing the Noah story in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. And since there's so much there, we don't have time to read through it all today or to go by verse. But we will be touching down in the story at times. So if you want to have your Bible open to Genesis 6 through 9, you can do that. Some of you, if you grew up in Sunday school, might have memories of someone showing you the Noah's Ark story with the cute little felt board and the cute little animals and the fluffy sheep kind of jumping onto the ark. And it was all cute and everything, all perfect, even though parts of the story are quite chaotic. As we go through this story today, if it's your first time hearing it or your 1,000th time hearing it, I invite you to open yourself up to what God might be speaking to you today through it this time. So the Noah story in the Old Testament picks up after the writers of Genesis list this long ancestry from Adam all the way to Noah. And the list starts off mentioning how Adam was made in the image of God, and him and Eve lived in relationship with God. But at the end of the ancestry, it talks about how God sees that humankind has more and more drifted away from God and decided to do things their own way. So much so that God couldn't stand the evil and wickedness that was going on. And in the midst of this dark time, it says, "But Noah found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. And in the midst of the evil in his time, Noah seemed to be one that remained faithful to God." And so in response to humankind's wickedness, God comes to Noah and tells them that he's going to flood the earth, wiping out all evil and wickedness that was going on. God still loved his creation, but hated the wickedness that was going on. And so he tells Noah to build an ark, or a boat, for Noah and his family and every kind of animal, so that they could be used to survive this flood and start again with God when the waters recede. So God gives Noah very specific instructions to build the boat and establishes with Noah a promise that he will preserve him and his family. And when the waters come and wipe out every living thing except all who are on the boat. After almost a year, the flood waters recede, and God called Noah and his family and the animals to come out onto dry land. When they come out of the ark, God tells Noah and his family that he promises never again will he wipe out humanity like that with a flood. So after looking at this story, I acknowledge that there are scholars and people that will go back and forth on little details of stories like the flood and say, well, how did this really happen? Or how did this really happen? And people do that a lot with Genesis 1 through 11. But I think really today, when we're looking at the story, the question we want to hold ourselves to is, what does the author want us to know about God and his relationship to humanity? What are they trying to show us? So that's what we have to ask ourselves today when we're looking at the Noah story. So I don't know about you, but when I read through the Noah story, the first thing that jumps out to me is a phrase. And it's a phrase that really shows Noah's obedience to God in his time. And the phrase is this: and Noah did as the Lord commanded him. And if you read through the Noah story, this phrase is actually repeated 4 times. The first time it says God gives Noah the promise that he's going to flood the earth, and he tells Noah very specifically how to make the ark and how to bring his family and 2 of every kind of living creature onto it. And it says Noah did just as God commanded him. And then, after building the ark and waiting for this flood to happen for 120 years, pretty crazy, we'll get to that later, God tells Noah to hop on board the ship along with the pairing of the animals, for in 7 days God said he would finally flood the earth. And it says, and Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. And then again, it says when Noah and his family were boarding the ark, it still says how the animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God commanded Noah. And finally, after just under a year in the boat at sea, the flood waters recede, and we see Noah and his family come out to dry land only after God tells them to. I think that the authors of this story are trying to make a point here about how simple Noah's obedience was, and quite frankly defines obedience for us. Noah heard what God told him and did accordingly. Put pretty simply, that's obedience. Heard what God told him and acted. And what's interesting is what we don't see when we read through this story is Noah wanting to fact-check God on how this whole flood thing was really going to pan out. We don't see much initial pushback. We just see a natural obedience in response to God's plan. And don't get me wrong, God can handle our pushback. In fact, he wants us to be honest. And maybe Noah was questioning a lot of God's plan to build the ark and to flood. But the story doesn't seem to focus on that. It just points us to Noah's simple obedience. It makes me think about when I was a kid, trying to figure out what the point was in obeying my parents. Like if you have kids now, or if you have raised kids before, what's one of the most annoying questions you can get asked when you tell your kid to do something? Why? And depending on who you were and the time and the day you were on, if you were my parents, you might say, well, because you're going to split your head open. You're not Superman. Or maybe after a long day, you say, well, because I told you to. But we don't seem to see any kind of response like that from Noah here. He just listens and obeys naturally. And does exactly how God told him to do everything. I think this kind of simple obedience stands out to me because I don't know how many times I have been that child to God wanting to know the why for everything. For every plan and thing God has asked me to do, especially the uncomfortable parts, I'm always calculating the risk and thinking whether or not I can really trust God, as if that's always my call. And it makes me think of this question, Is your walk with the Lord characterized by simple obedience? Or are you like me, sometimes wanting more clarity, more in-depth blueprints before you start building? It's kind of simple obedience. And then the other side of Noah's obedience that seemed so natural to him was that it was in essence countercultural. It was so radical. During the building of the ark, Noah must have experienced what it's like to go up the down escalator of his time, or to go left when everyone else was going right. Because what we see of people around Noah at his time is some were indulging in wicked behavior and things that were not pleasing to God. But I imagine that some people were just also trying to live normal daily lives, trying to have a successful living for them and their family. And yet Noah didn't hold so tight to his work and life that a plan like this from God would simply be too much for him. People around Noah probably had logical reactions to not hopping in that boat with him. Maybe they were caught up in their jobs, caught up in selfish desires, or maybe some of them just couldn't believe that after 120 years that this flood was still going to happen. They're probably thinking, okay, Noah's been in the sun far too many days. He's a little crazy. Just let him build the thing. At least it looks nice. And we live in a world right now where we can barely wait 120 seconds for something, let alone 120 years. Now you might be thinking, why? That's so crazy, 120 years? But in this time, we do see that people lived longer lifespans in general. So Noah, we see, was actually 950 years old when he died. But even in that sense, 120 years of building and waiting for this flood to happen was still over a tenth of his life. So if it were us, think about having something taking you 10 to 20 years of you trying to be obedient to and building without seeing much sign of God's promise coming through until the very end. While everyone was caught up in the immediate desires and wants of that time, Noah seemed to have his gaze on something bigger. He seemed to have such a security and focus in what he was doing. And it takes us to this question that Noah's obedience to God in this story is so simple, so radical, that it begs us to look at how this is even possible. What was it that got Noah up every morning for 120 years, being obedient for so long, for something he had yet to even see proof of? And put pretty simply, it's this. Noah knew the voice that was speaking to him. We see that Noah had a relationship with God. They go back. God had a track record with Noah. See, Noah's obedience wasn't about just following the rules to make himself feel better or obeying whatever he wanted to do in the moment like everyone else was. His obedience was anchored in a relationship. And Noah listened to the voice that he could trust. We see this because at the beginning of the Noah story, it says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Now, that doesn't mean that Noah never made a mistake, but what it does mean is he had a relationship with God, and it was based on trust. It says he walked with God. He had a history with him. In other words, Noah obeyed God because he trusted God's voice. Just like a kid growing up who has a parent they can trust, you will obey who you trust and who you love. Noah had seen how God had been faithful in the past, so he was willing to obey God with the present. For me, growing up, I was learning to obey my parents, and after enough times of going against their advice and hurting myself with various stunts, I began to just follow their rules because after a while, that's all I knew. And I tried to be a pretty good kid, but the problem was it crept into how I saw God. Since I was such a rule follower, I translated that into life with God and assumed that all God wanted from me was just to kind of follow the rules and try to be a good person. It wasn't until high school at a youth group retreat that during a time of worship, I had this overwhelming feeling of God calling out to me, telling me that he didn't just want me as a rule follower, he just wanted me. He wanted my heart, and he was trying to speak to me. And that totally changed the way I viewed obedience to God from then on. Since that point, I have come to see obedience as a response to God's love, not as a way to earn it or deserve it, but in a response to God's love to me. I began to know God more personally and began to have a heart that just wanted what He wanted. And I listened to His voice instead of just trying to follow what I thought were the rules. And now I'm at a time in my life where I know certain passions and roles God is calling me to, but I don't necessarily know the whole plan. But what I do know is all of the times in my past that God showed up and used my obedience for a plan greater than myself. And this allows me to listen to where God is leading me in different areas of life and to trust that inner voice because I know who's speaking to me. You see, this is the difference when you see obedience to God is not just adhering to a bunch of rules, but as a response to a voice you can trust. When you are listening to a voice you can trust, you will find yourself doing pretty crazy things, sometimes without much hesitation. And that's the most astounding thing to me about Noah's simple obedience, was that he was going off nothing. You know, it's not like Noah was simply trying to follow what he read in the Gospels or something, because Jesus wasn't even on the scene yet. In other words, Noah's obedience to God was unprecedented. It was going off the page with little or no evidence. This kind of trust makes me think about when I was a kid, my family and I would go to public swimming pools during the summer to cool off. And there'd be times where I was young enough and I didn't quite know how to swim, and I'd be still standing on the edge of the pool, and I would see my dad swim towards the deep end of the pool. And he would summon me over to walk to the edge of the pool in the deep end. And as I'm walking over, he's treading water, and he's looking up at me, and he calls out to me and says, "Jump in, I'll catch you." And I imagine I was standing there at first like, hold on here, are you crazy? I don't have a life jacket. Where are my little floaty wings? How will I land? How will you catch me? How am I going to get back to dry land? What do you guys think my dad's response was? Did he answer all those questions specifically? No, he said, "Daniel, it's me. I'm right here. You don't have to worry. You can trust me." As a kid, if you have a parent whose voice you can trust, you'll do pretty much anything without explanation, other than you know that the voice telling you to do something is trustworthy. And as we looked at earlier, because Noah was listening to a voice he could trust, he was willing to obey in a way nobody else was doing. Because Noah trusted God's voice, he didn't care what his obedience cost him. Noah wasn't concerned with listening to the voices in his time that told him to eat, drink, and be merry and have a good life. He had a deeper voice that he was in tune with, and one that he knew would lead to life. I think that the author of Hebrews is trying to show us that in Hebrews 11, all the people listed in this chapter, the people that we're going to be following with in this series, all obeyed in unprecedented ways. They followed God off the page of what they were used to because they knew who was speaking to them. People mentioned in Hebrews 11 who listened to that voice they could trust, built arks where there was no sea in sight, left homelands for places they knew nothing about, gave birth when they deemed it impossible, protected their kid from authorities so he could be a blessing to the people of Israel and all people. People who were listening to this voice walked through seas but on dry land, marched around empires as they witnessed walls crumble. And in Hebrews 11, that's just the beginning. And this is the crazy part, is that all these people we read about had a relationship with God, but in the here and now, we have the fulfilled promise and person of Jesus. And we have access to hearing God's voice through the Holy Spirit. This makes me think of the time in John 10 when Jesus is talking to skeptics of his at the time. And he calls himself the Good Shepherd. And he says, all who know him and follow him are like his sheep. And Jesus goes on to say that my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. Jesus tells us that like a shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, Jesus has laid down his life on behalf of us. And that's the reality and the love that is given to us. And that's the voice that is calling us into obedience. Friends, we have a voice, and we have a God whose voice we can trust. We have the opportunity to obey this inner voice of love that speaks to us and invites us into relationship and life with him. And his question will always be this when he calls us to something. Just like my dad calling from the deep waters of the pool, do you trust me? The thing I want to end with today is that not only is our obedience just between us and God, it's not just a private thing. It's public. It's for everyone. When we say yes to God, he will use us to bless the world around us. Noah said yes to God to build an ark, and in doing so was used as a blessing for all generations to follow. There are people in your life right now that are waiting to be blessed, waiting to hear of Jesus, and they're on the other side of your obedience, on the other side of your yes to the voice of God that you can trust. I don't know what it is for you. I don't know what God might be putting on your heart right now. I mean, maybe you're just tired of following voices in your life that you realize aren't that trustworthy, and they've led you to dead ends. And maybe you're feeling led to say yes for the first time to God's love, calling you to relationship with him. Or maybe you've been walking with God for a while now, but don't really know how God is leading you and calling you to obey because you haven't really been listening to his voice, whether that's through prayer or music or reading scripture. Or maybe God's been calling you to obey something for a while now. You've just been waiting for a greater detail of blueprints, when God's simply asking you, do you trust me? The reality is that the same voice that called Noah to obey is the same voice that is calling to us, and it's one we can trust. As we finish up our time together this morning, I'm going to put 3 questions on the screen for us to think about, so I'll read through them once. First question is this: if someone followed you for a week, what would they say you believe in? Question 2, what things are distracting you from simple and radical obedience to Jesus? And question 3, what is one thing you can do this week that would show someone that you are following Jesus? Or in other words, what is your yes this week to that voice of God that you can trust? What's that act of obedience this week? And what does that look like for you? So let's take 30 seconds and prayerfully consider those questions. God, we thank you for giving us yourself and for inviting us into relationship and life with you. We thank you for your son Jesus, who is perfectly obedient for us, so that we would be transformed into people living lives of obedience in return. God, help us when we doubt. Help us when we're uncertain. Help us to listen to your voice and give us the confidence to say yes. Anchor us in trust in your leading, individually and as a church body for your glory. Amen.